Isn't that pretty? You know, I got up on this quiet Thursday and it occurred to me that it would be just the perfect day to listen to Hector Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique all day long. I know you've had the same thoughts down there in Riverland and up in Long Prairie, Grey Eagle. And that's what I've been doing. I've been listening to Hector Berlioz, who I really admire. I'm sorry I didn't get this lesson out to you yesterday, and I know it's asynchronous and stuff, and but I did it. I'm doing it. I'm going to make sure that you get 3 like half-hour condensations of whatever I offer to my live Zoom classes. And when you pile faith formation into the Wednesday evening, I've told you that I do that. I couldn't be happier. I was teaching all day long, morning till night, and now on this quiet Thursday afternoon, just prior to 3 o'clock, with the birds a fluttering at my feeders, I'm here to say hello and keep things going here a little bit as the semester winds down like a tired clock. To preview a little bit, I went on the hunt yesterday for a poem by a Southern writer named Greg Brown. That's how primitive my head is. Okay, if you're teaching William Faulkner, why don't you give him a poem from someone who's from the south of the Mason-Dixon line, as we say. Couldn't find the Greg Brown poem I was looking for, and then of course when you're looking for one book, you start finding other books. And I got so many. I'm so happy to have so many beautiful poetry books. Doesn't have anything to do with William Faulkner, and I don't care. I want to read you a Philip Levine poem. And I know you'll forgive me for being partial to poems that are about school, especially about teachers. And that won't take very long. It also seems like a good day. It seemed like a good day yesterday, and it still is the same kind of day, to get you to do a couple of basic things, just to run some images of William Faulkner and his life and times before you, and just tell some stories about his life. Some people don't care about writers and their biography, but I do, and I know at least some students do. So at least some of you will be happy. And I've already talked to you about how much I just love looking at old photographs, old black and white photographs. The older the better, especially if they depict a famous writer. And I've also got to talk to you today about something kind of complicated. I'll probably make it complicated, maybe it isn't. There is a literary technique that I have that is enlisted by William Faulkner, and it's called stream of consciousness. And we can't do exactly at all what I did yesterday with my Comp 1 students. Before I even said a thing, I said, okay, grab a piece of paper, 9 and 10 o'clock, and I had them do this. I had them just pick up a pen or a pencil, and I timed them with my phone. I said, I want you to write continuously for 2 minutes. I want you to put that pen or that pencil on the paper and just write. Don't worry about spelling. Don't worry about punctuation, any convention of writing. Just start writing. The most important thing is, don't stop for crap. Just keep that pen or pencil going. Whatever you got, a crayon, just keep it going. And I'll time you, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and your hand's going to hurt. But you're going to do it, and I'll explain why later. Well, I was kind of enacting an experiment in stream of consciousness, and I'd like to talk about that to end our time together today, and sort of give you the origin story. Borges once said that nobody is the literary atom. He wasn't quite right on that. I really think James Joyce, the great Irish writer, was the guy who invented this technique, and I'll talk about it. I'll talk about it as it relates to Faulkner, and then we'll end our time together today with a beautiful little 3-minute vid that depicts what it is like, or what it's like to experience. But I've also got to put some reservations before you, too. I sometimes wonder if experimenting with art, experimenting with literature can do art harm. I know painters have to experiment, dancers have to experiment, guitar players have to experiment. How can you get anywhere? When is that experimentation taken too far? I don't have the answer, but I do have the question. So I think that's our day. And real quickly, Philip Levine was the teacher, the very demanding teacher of some of the poets that I've hosted, most notably Nick Flynn and Marie Howe. And they said that he could be really demanding of them. He had Severus Skywalker loved that quote by Hemingway way back early, it's weeks ago. Hemingway had said, you'll remember, Severus, that every writer has a built-in shock-proof, you-know-what, detector. And that's what Philip Levine was like as a teacher. When he picked up a bad poem, if you were the writer of it, he let you know. And he died of cancer not that long ago. He was the famous poet laureate of Detroit. He loved Detroit, Michigan, even though that'd be a city I'd never want to live in. He loved writing about factory workers and auto workers and people, near the grime and the dirt, making our stuff. And this is it's more of a spring poem, and I should be saving it for April, but it's too late. And here it is. Also unavailable to me is the prank, a light prank. I prank my students once in a while when I can see them. And I usually introduce this poem in my big classroom, E339, by going up to the dreamiest blackboard in the world. I grab a piece of chalk to start the class, and I make a sharp line from right to left, diagonally down. And then I turn to the class and say, what have I done? And they're just like, what are you talking about? And I say it again, what have I done? And sometimes there's some guessing, sometimes not. Well, and then I just start reading the poem. M. Dagus teaches art and science at Durfee Intermediate School, Detroit, 1942. He made a line on the blackboard, one bold stroke from right to left, diagonally downward, and stood back to ask, as always, at no one in particular, what have I done? From the back of the room, Freddie shouted, you've broken a piece of chalk. M. Dagus did not smile. What have I done? He repeated. The most intellectual students looked down to study their desks, except for Gertrude Bimler, who raised her hand before she spoke. M. Dagus, you have created the hypotenuse of an isosceles triangle, Dagus mused. Everyone knew that Gertrude could not be incorrect. It is possible, Louis Warshawski added precisely, that you have begun to represent the roof of a barn. I remember that it was exactly 20 minutes past 11, and I thought at worst this could go on another 40 minutes. It was early April. The snow had all but melted on the playgrounds. The elms and maples bordering the cracked walks shivered in the new winds, and I believed that before I knew it, I'd be swaggering to the candy store for a Milky Way. M. Dagus pursed his lips, and the room stilled until the long hand of the clock moved to 21, as though in complicity with Gertrude, who added confidently, you've begun to separate the dark from the dark. I looked back for help, but now the trees bucked and quaked, and I knew this could go on forever. From his book, What Work Is, Philip Levine. And I hope you're all well down there. Now, William Faulkner, let's just do the biography thing, and I'll drop some photos in, and you can have a look at him. Well, let's start at the beginning, shall we? William Faulkner was born on September 25th. That's a great date to be born on. Excuse me, 1897. Excuse me, again, in that little breath of years, 1896 to the year 1900, when all these writers were born. It's just a magical time. And his original name was William Cuthbert Faulkner, but Faulkner, as he inherited his name, was Falkner. He had a relatively famous grandfather who actually got up his own regiment during the Civil War, who wrote some bad novels. That's where the literary gene came from, possibly. And that guy, his grandfather, the other thing I know about him is he died of a duel. This is a time in our country where if a couple guys got mad at each other and had a disagreement, well, you'd go to a barn or some field and walk, 40, 50 paces from one another and turn around and try to shoot each other. And his grandfather lost. Billy Faulkner, like everybody, had a couple of parents, Maud and Murray Faulkner. Murray was kind of an idiot, and he lost a family fortune because he got the big idea to start up this big horse rental scheme, even though Henry Ford was starting to crank automobiles out of Detroit, Michigan, where Philip Levine was from. and a lot of money, a big pile of money was burning in their yard before too long. Rough marriage between Maud and Murray. They were very different, and Billy Faulkner, the little Billy Faulkner, had to live through that. His mother, Maud, was a cultivated woman, right? She was into music and poetry and reading and literature and looking at paintings all day, and so she was into culture. Not Murray. He was a drinker, a smoker, a gambler, and he made sure that young William Faulkner could handle firearms and ride a horse before he was 4 or 5 years old. So there's a tension, right? A pulling, and those tensions would stay within William Faulkner all of his life. Here's a grainy photo of him in World War I. He did, like I told you, the only writer in this group that saw any action, that got near the blood, was Hemingway. Fitzgerald, as you know, was marched off that boat for the armistice, and William Faulkner he didn't have the kind of physique for soldiering, right? He had flat feet. He was just a little guy. And he did learn how to fly planes over there, but again, he never saw any action. But he did come home on a cane because he had a little bit too much to drink, and he crashed he crashed into a tree with a plane, hit an oak tree. And he came home and proclaimed that that was his war injury, which was the beginning of his mythology. You can see here that he went to Paris, but only for like 5 minutes, like long enough to grow a beard like all of the rest of these writers. And then he came home for good. Provincial dude. He did not want to be very far from his beloved state, Mississippi. And then he had some struggles, okay? I got a lot of William Faulkner stories in my head, and probably the most important ones I can tell you is that he was not a student, okay? He barely graduated high school, flunked out of college after only 1 year at the University of Oxford in Mississippi. And all he wanted to do was write and read and write and draw. He loved drawing. And what you need to know is that his first 2 literary attempts were complete failures. He tried a book of poetry, because every novelist wants to be a poet. He tried to write a book called The Marble Fawn. It was a catastrophe. It's just a collection of crap, narcissistic poetry from his young brain. And it did not work out. And it's still in the library over at St. John's. I visited once and I picked it up and I'm like, are you kidding? Then he wrote a bad novel called Soldier's Pay. And I will skip the uncharming plot of that. It's about a soldier that, I'm telling it, aren't I? It's about a soldier that comes home after World War I. And he meets his fiancée, and one of the things that he has to tell her right away when he gets off the boat is that he's had a pretty unfortunate wartime injury. Know what I'm talking about, dudes? Like, what would the last thing be that you'd want blown off, probably? Well, I know my answer. And it was just a brutal, and badly written novel that he used to punish a woman named Estelle Alden, who he grew up next door to and was in love with, and she ran away with a lawyer. And it's just a working out of how mad he was at her, because the fiancé is really mean and untrue to the guy because he doesn't have his little bit anymore. Faulkner would later marry Estelle. She would come back, divorce that lawyer, and they would begin like one of the worst literary marriages ever. Again, plates flying through the air. Just like Fitzgerald and his wife, Zelda, and just like Hemingway and all his wives and all the women that he did things with that he should not have. Then he gets this idea, you guys, and this cannot, the importance of this cannot be overstated. And you're Faulkner, right? You're in your 20s, you got a bad book of poetry, you've written a bad novel, and he got this idea. He realized, and I'm quoting now, that my own postage stamp of earth could be the very place where I turn the real into the apocryphal. To be a little bit more specific, what Faulkner decided to do was imagine a county. He dreamed into being a county that he called Yakmapatafa. He gave it an Indian name, and he even drew it. And he decided that he would spend the rest of his life taking the countryside, the people in the countryside around him, and all the stories that he was hearing and grew up hearing, and spend the rest of his life writing short stories and novels set only in one county. This was a genius move. It unleashed him in a huge way. And we'll talk later about how another great writer, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, took this idea and just stole it, man. He loved it so much, and we'll talk about that on another day. Once he got this idea, once he had what Minnesotans would call a deal, his deal, he started producing some of the most important novels of the 20th century, including Sartre's, including As I Lay Dying, the shorter novel that you're reading, Light in August, and The Sound and the Fury. He wrote 18, I believe, but those were the big ones. Most writers produce their best work in their 30s. And here's a photograph of him that I love the most. I believe this was taken the year that he wrote Light in August. A couple other things I want to show you, photos of him. Here's William Faulkner looking like $1 million, standing in front of a plane that he bought. And this is kind of a sadder thing to talk about. William Faulkner, like all these writers, ended up going to Hollywood to make his money. And because Hollywood, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's, they paid fortunes to great writers to write screenplays. And there was a point where Faulkner was making $6,000 a month. That's a lot of money. That's more than I'm making right now, by a lot. And Hollywood just did him so much harm. He drank too much there. He was away from his wife and his family. Sometimes he drank so much he ended up in hospitals. He had affairs with secretaries. It was bad news. And sometimes he came home with the money and did things that ended up being a bad idea. Like here he's standing in front of that plane that he was able to buy. And here was his idea. He had a brother named Dean that wasn't really catching on in the world. And his cockamamie scheme was to start up one of those, primitive aerial shows with a biplane, putting on, tricks for people who would pay to watch it. And there was a morning where there was dew on the wings, and his brother Dean decided to do a little wing walking. Well, that didn't go badly. He fell from that plane, and that haunted Faulkner all of his life. It really, really bothered him. He felt like the cause of that effect, and maybe it was. And Faulkner wrote the inscription for the stone that would mark the grave of his brother Dean. On eagle's wings I will raise you up, which became a song. Some of you might know that hymn. I don't know if there's any horse people down there. Brainerd, holy cow, is that horse country. I've always got students who are into horses, and this photograph is really a classic photograph of William Faulkner. He was a Southern gentleman. He fancied himself that, right? Like he put on the whole get-up, the red coat, the black boots, and he would ride in the pastures of the sort of the antebellum former, plantation house that he bought, that he gave the name of a very famous Scottish oak tree, Rowan Oak, to. And I'm happy to report to you that he loved riding, but I'm sorry to report to you that this horse would be the end of him. This horse, one afternoon in his early 60s, when he was getting frail, decided to bury its hooves, just plant them, and Faulkner went up over the top of the horse, landed on his back on a rock in the pasture, which broke his back, and in spite of that, he still got back up on the horse, rode it back to the farmhouse. His wife said, what is the matter with you? Why did you get back up on the horse? And Faulkner told her that he wanted to show that horse who was boss, which is something. He self-medicated for a couple of days with pure gin, not great medicine. Pneumonia set in, and he died in 1963. Stood up out of bed in a little hospital in Oxford, Mississippi. His last word before he fell forward, smashing his face on the tiles, was "Nurse." Someday we'll have a separate class where I go over writers' famous last words. I just love those, and I've got a little collection in my head. And here is a photograph of William Faulkner winning the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he truly, truly deserved. And he was so nervous that we couldn't even hear what he said when he gave the big banquet speech, and he had to record it later for posterity. And Friday would probably be a good day to take a look at that. Now, what I want to talk about for a little while now, trying to see how focused I am here. Things seem kind of blurry. What I want to talk about for a little while today is a literary technique that you're going to see in the prose of William Faulkner. Now think back to that little story I told you about those students who I had write for 2 consecutive minutes. There was no time to ask my 9 o'clock people for volunteers to read. Somehow we found time during the 10 o'clock class. And you know what? They really had trouble doing anything but writing in complete sentences. But here's the most important thing I want to tell you. I know writers have to experiment. I know all artists have to experiment. But I want to tell you that there's something to be said for, this is me, this is my dinosaur head, this is not out of some book, this is just the way I think. I'm getting older and I kind of like tradition, and I kind of like traditional art forms, and I have a real nervousness about the idea that too much experimentation can do harm to an art form. We now, at this point, have what Borges would call trick novels, novels that run backwards, novels that come together in a non-linear way. In fact, there's a lot of writers taking it way, way too far. Like David Eggert has a novel that he wrote, an entire novel written and made up out of Arby's customer comment cards. Okay, that's too far out there for me, even though the novel's kind of fun. When I think of form, and this is something I should have brought up when I was talking about form, when we were going through the houses of rhetoric, invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery, I should have brought up the name of this man, Richard Bresnahan. This guy, this bald guy, Richard Bresnahan, who's getting to be an older cat now, is a very famous potter. And I taught his kids at St. John's University. I think he's the most important potter in the United States of America. He's more well known than anybody. And he built and runs, we fire it every other year, something called the Joanna Kiln, the Sister Joanna Kiln. It is the longest wood-fired kiln in all of North America. And every fall, all the hipsters in my township go. We go, man. It's always an October day. It's always sunny. And he fires that thing, it goes off like a bomb. And there's sometimes as many as 2,000 pieces of pottery in that kiln. And we have a meal that can't be beat, and we all get a little cup of sake from cups that he's made. I don't drink sake. I think it's kind of nasty. But I always pour it out and then take the cup because I love these little cups. And I got a pretty good sized collection of these because I go every time. Here's what I want to tell you. Potters understand form. And the quick story I'll tell you about Richard Bresnahan is that when he went to Japan when he was a boy to learn how to be a potter, he went into the mountains and apprenticed with a family for several years that had been making pottery for like 7 or 8 generations. When he got there, they didn't even let him near the wheel for weeks, months. They didn't let him even touch the clay. His job was to make lunch and work in the garden and make sure that the other potters were fed, cleaned up the pottery studio at the end of the day, and eventually they let him start in on throwing. And his mission, from his, whoever was in charge of it, the head potter, probably the patriarch of the family, every day as a young man, Richard got up and he would make like 200 cups, the same form, again and again and again. He'd make 200 of these and then they'd be destroyed at the end of the day, and the next day he'd make 200 bowls, 200 vases, 200 whatever. And I just love the idea of that it took a special and almost perfect adherence to form. And I've been in this guy's studio so many times. It's also the greatest place to hear a poetry reading. They let me guest host a poetry reading there 3 years ago. I'm proud of that. Even though I'm long out of there, they love me well in that studio. I just love the idea of that there wasn't a whole lot of experimentation going on. So to cut to it, the writers in the early 20th century, Fitzgerald tried it, Hemingway tried it, especially when people have too much to drink, like the priest in A Farewell to Arms. What they really tried to do was try to get consciousness, human consciousness, what it's like, what it might read like on paper, which is an impossible thing. I mean, what's in your head? Whoa, I just saw the kitchen sink. There's the National Guard. There's thousands and thousands of memories, right? It's not practical. But there's an origin story, and this is how we will conclude today. There's an Irish writer named James Joyce who wrote a novel called Ulysses, which is a 900-page monster. Okay, anytime I run across a reader that is so serious that they come up to me, lately, 2 years ago, it was Noah Mogensen came up to me at Brainerd and said, now I want a book that I can't read. Well, I gave him my last copy of Ulysses. I haven't seen that book since. He's probably still trying to read it. Ulysses is a monster novel, 900 pages, that covers 24 hours in the life of a character named Leopold Bloom. This book is so famous in Ireland that June 21st, which is the date the book happens, is called Bloomsday. And at the University of Dublin, they always have a public reading of the entire novel. All the famous people in Ireland come to this theater and they take turns reading a few pages. Many years, it takes almost exactly 24 hours. Think about that. So at the end of the novel, after a long day of carousing and running around and doing all kinds of things, Leopold Bloom comes home to his wife, Molly Bloom, and he's made a young friend named Stephen Dedalus that would star in another novel by Joyce called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And again, there's Joyce using the mythological. And the scene is this. They're down in the kitchen, and they're continuing to drink Irish whiskey, and Molly Bloom is laying on a bed without a stitch of clothing upstairs, listening to the men talk. You got to pay attention to naked people in literature. It's just a basic rule. They're always important. Kind of joking, not quite. See Cassandra and Aeschylus. And Molly, while listening to them, starts thinking. And Joyce goes right into her head and tries to get down on paper the interiority of her life, what she's thinking, what she's feeling, what she's remembering. And you hit a sentence that runs about 50 pages without a period. No commas, no semicolons, no dashes. It's just flow of language, of thinking. And it is one of the most dramatic early experiments in literature in 20th century letters. And you need this is just basic history. You need to know this. Your clue? When is Faulkner using stream of consciousness? Anytime you see italics. When you see italics, when you see him lock italics, suddenly there's going to be no punctuation, no capitalization. That's your clue. When you see italics, you're going into someone's heart and soul. And you kind of have to surrender to the art of it if you're interested in stuff like that. Let's end with a beautiful little 3-minute clip of an imagining of the last 50 lines of James Joyce Ulysses. And you see that it really kind of works. Don't seek out that novel. It's naughty. And don't seek, well, I'm not going to say anything more because if I prohibit you from doing it, you'll run and do it. I often think I could make more headway unassigning literature, forbidding students, saying, don't touch that stuff. It's dangerous. It's bad for you. Don't you dare read that. I think people might read more. Nothing makes people want to read more than when a book is banned. So let's get this edited and get over to St. John's and keep going on through the time of trials. Stay safe and well. Love you guys. God bless.
God of heaven, there's nothing like nature. The wild mountains and then the sea, the waves rushing. And as for them saying that there's no God, well, I wouldn't give a snap of me 2 fingers for all their learning. Who was the first person in the universe before there was anybody that made it all? Who? That they don't know, and neither do I. So there you are. Might as well try and stop the sun from rising tomorrow. The sun shines for you, he said. The day we were lying among the rhododendrons on Hoath Head in the grey tweed suit and his straw hat. The day I got him to propose to me, yes. First I gave him the bit of seed cake out of my mouth, and it was leap year, like now, yes. 16 years ago. My God, after that long kiss, I near lost my breath, yes. He said I was a flower of the mountain, yes. And that was one true thing he said in his life. And the sun shines for you today, yes. And that was why I liked him. Because I saw he understood or felt who a woman is, and I knew I could always get around him. And I gave him all the pleasure I could leading him on till he asked me to say yes. And I wouldn't answer first, only looked out over the sea and the sky, and I was thinking of so many things he didn't know. Of Mulvey and Mr. Stanhope and father and old Captain Groves and the Spanish girls laughing. And the sea, crimson sometimes like fire, and the glorious sunsets, yes. And Gibraltar as a young girl where I was a flower of the mountain, yes. And I thought, well, as well him as another. And then I asked him with my eyes to ask again, yes. And he asked me, would I to say yes, my mountain flower? And first I put my arms around him, yes. And I drew him down to me, so he could feel my breasts all perfume, yes. And his heart was going like mad. And yes, I said yes, I will, yes.